The prairie always woke before the sun. It began with a hush, the restless low of cattle in the distance, the restless shift of earth waiting for heat. Elias McGraw rode alone through the pale gray dawn, his horse's hooves muffled by dust, his breath lingering in the cold air. He had been to town for supplies and whiskey he did not drink, and he carried home nothing heavier than silence. Land stretched wide around him, endless, indifferent. A man could ride 100 miles and still feel as small as a nail head on a coffin lid. Elias knew that feeling too well. It was the ache that came when nights were too long, when the firelight warmed no other hands but his. That was when he saw her. At first, she seemed a shadow among rocks, just another heap of earth abandoned by God. But the closer he rode, the clearer she became, a woman crumpled by the creekside, hair tangled, dress torn by thorns. Her hands were pressed hard against her chest, a cloth clutched in shaking fingers. Her lips trembled. "Please don't pull it." The words hung thin like thread about to snap. Elias swung down from the saddle, cautious, his boots crunching gravel. His eyes narrowed. This country was riddled with tricks. Bandits sometimes left bait by the roadside, a wounded decoy to lure the soft-hearted. But when he bent closer, suspicion gave way to something else. Pity, sharp and unexpected. The cloth she held was soaked deep red. Beneath it, an arrow's haft jutted, broken and cruel. Her skin glistened with fever sweat, her breath shallow as if each draw cost her half a soul. "Don't move," Elias said, voice rough but steady. She shook her head weakly, eyes wide with terror. "Don't take it out. Please." Elias had seen wounds before. In the war, in bar fights, in lonely canyons where men fell and never rose again. He knew enough, sometimes pulling meant death, but sometimes leaving meant worse. His hand hovered, torn between mercy and fear. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked, stunned by the question, then whispered, "Clara Boone." Her voice cracked like dry timber under weight. Elias nodded once. "You'll die out here." Her lips quivered into something like a smile, sad, almost mocking. Maybe that's the plan. But Elias could not leave her. He lifted her into the saddle, careful of the cloth pressed against her chest, and led the horse back toward his ranch. She was light as a bundle of reeds, but each groan that slipped from her lips cut deeper than steel. The ride was long, the silence heavier still. Clara's head sagged against his shoulder. Her breath came in shallow tides. Elias felt her tremor through the cloth of his coat. He kept his jaw clenched, not daring to speak. When at last the ranch came into sight, a modest cabin crouched against the swell of prairie, its boards weathered gray, Elias felt no relief. He felt the weight of decision, of what it meant to bring a stranger into his solitude. As he carried Clara inside, May Callahan's sharp voice called from across the fence. The widow was hanging laundry, her eyes narrowing at the sight. "Elias McGraw," she said, suspicion thick. "What's that you're draggin' home?" "A wounded soul," Elias muttered. May sniffed, lips pressed thin. "You know what folks'll say. A woman found like that." "Let 'em say," Elias snapped, though doubt stirred in his gut. He carried Clara inside and shut the door. The cabin was dim, its single window spilling pale morning light. Elias laid her on his bed, the only bed, and stoked the fire to life. The air filled with the sharp tang of smoke and boiling water. Clara's eyes fluttered, half shut, her hand still clenched over that trembling cloth. He knelt beside her. "Let me look." Her fingers tightened. "No. You'll die. Better that, than him finding me." Her words froze him. Always a him. There was always some man behind a woman's fear in this land. Elias sat back, his hands trembling though his face stayed stone. Outside, the world carried on. The cattle lowed, the wind rattled loose shingles, but inside that small cabin, time seemed to stall. The only sound was Clara's breath, ragged and shallow, and the faint drip of blood seeping through cloth. Elias pressed his palm to his forehead. He thought of the whispers already curling in May Callahan's mind, the sheriff's suspicious gaze should he ride by, the weight of a town's judgment. A rancher alone with a strange woman, her past a mystery, her wound a danger. Yet he could not harden himself against the sight of her lips moving in fevered prayer. That night, Elias sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, rifle across his lap, eyes never leaving her. The fire threw restless shadows against the walls, shaping her figure into something ghost-like, fragile yet fierce. The prairie wind howled against the shutters. And Elias thought, the night whispers louder than storms, asking if mercy is worth the ruin it might bring. Clara tossed beneath the quilt, her breath thin, her face damp with sweat that glistened in the firelight. Elias McGraw sat close, changing cloths at her brow, ladling broth to lips that barely moved. His rough hands, more used to ropes and branding irons, fumbled clumsy as a child. Still he kept on. When she stirred, her eyes found him with a wary softness, like a coyote caught between fleeing and staying. She never thanked him, never pleaded, but Elias read the gratitude in the way her trembling fingers eased when he held the cup steady for her. Day bled into night, and nights bled into days. The arrow stayed lodged, the cloth pressed firm, her secret unyielding. Elias asked no more, though the question gnawed at him like a splinter under skin. One evening, as the prairie wind rattled the shutters, Clara's voice cut through the silence. "Why do you keep me here?" Elias looked up from the fire, where sparks leapt and died in the air. "Because you're breathing. And it ain't my way to watch someone stop." Her lips tightened. "Mercy is costly. Don't pretend it isn't." The words stung more than he expected. Elias shifted, gaze dropping to the floorboards. "Then let it cost me. Not you." She turned her face to the wall, shoulders shuddering as though the weight of his kindness was heavier than cruelty. The world outside did not forget her presence. May Callahan appeared one morning with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Her eyes darted to the closed bedroom door. "Words out already," May said, setting the bread on the table. "A woman alone under your roof. Folks will think the worst." Elias straightened, jaw taut. "Let them think. They always do." May's gaze softened, though her tongue stayed sharp. "It's not just your name at stake, Elias. Women like her bring storms with them. You can't keep storms out with walls." When she left, the silence returned, but heavier. Elias sat at the table long after, staring at the untouched bread. Clara grew stronger in body, if not in spirit. She sat at the table one afternoon, her back straight, her face pale but calm. "I'll leave," she said simply. Elias, caught off guard, set down his tin cup. "Where to?" "Anywhere but here. I won't drag your life into mine." He almost told her she already had. Instead he only said, "You won't get a mile." Her eyes flicked to him, challenging, almost daring. "Better to die in the dust than rot in pity." The words bit, but Elias did not reply. Shame crept over him, though he didn't know if it was his or hers. That night, while the prairie stormed outside, Clara's voice broke the silence again. She sat by the window, hair loose, the fire behind her. A hymn slipped from her lips, soft and trembling, the kind Elias hadn't heard since boyhood. He didn't move, only listened. Each note wound around him, fragile as smoke, yet strong enough to stir something in his chest he thought long dead. He watched her silhouette against the glass, small, fragile but unyielding. She never knew he listened. Days later, the truth began to bleed out, not through words but fragments. She spoke of a man named Hawk Redford, a drifter with a charm as sharp as his knife. He had promised her the world, then caged her in his shadow. When she tried to leave, his wrath followed. "That arrow," she whispered, fingers tightening around the cloth. "It wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to mark me." Her voice trembled. "He doesn't need chains. Pain is his brand." Elias's gut tightened. He knew Hawk by name, a man who drifted from town to town, leaving whispers of theft, cruelty, women broken in his wake. A man whose smile made sheriffs hesitate and neighbors turn their eyes away. Clara's eyes locked on his, fierce through her fear. If I live, he'll come. If I die, he'll come still. And she was right. The sheriff rode up that evening, his horse's hooves thundering against the dry earth. Sheriff Tom Halley leaned in the saddle, hat low, eyes sharp. "Evenin', Elias." Elias stepped outside, rifle resting against the doorframe. "Sheriff." The lawman's gaze shifted toward the cabin. "There's talk. Woman. Hurt bad. Folks say you brought her here." Elias kept his face still. "Talk's cheap." Sheriff Halley's lips pressed tight. "Cheap or not, it spreads. You know Hawk Redford's been seen ridin' the ridges. If she's here, he'll come sniffin'. And when he does, your land won't keep him out." The weight of those words lingered long after the sheriff rode away. Elias turned back into the cabin. Clara sat in the dim, hand over the cloth, eyes unblinking. Between them, silence burned hotter than fire. That night, as Elias lay awake in his chair, watching her chest rise and fall, he realized something had shifted. It wasn't desire nor pity, nor the simple mercy of a man too stubborn to let death win. It was something harder, something rawer, the faint beginning of trust. Two souls scarred by isolation daring, just barely, to stand in the ashes of what had burned them. And yet, outside the cabin walls, he knew the storm had only begun. Between us burned not desire, but something harder. Two souls asking if trust could rise from ashes. The prairie at dawn was a blade of silence. Not a bird stirred, not a hoof sounded, just the pale stretch of horizon waiting. Elias McGraw stood on his porch, rifle in hand, watching the dust cloud forming in the east. He had known it would come. Clara stirred inside the cabin. He could hear the soft scrape of her chair, the faint cough in her throat. When she appeared in the doorway, pale but standing, the cloth still pressed against her chest, her eyes locked on the horizon as if she already knew who rode toward them. "Hawk Redford," she whispered. The name carried weight, thick and poisonous. By mid-morning, Hawk arrived. He was a tall figure with a smile carved too thin, his black hat low, his horse restless beneath him. Sheriff Halley trailed behind, jaw tight, eyes darting like a man already caught in compromise. "Elias McGraw," Hawk called, his voice smooth as oil over stone. "You've got something of mine." Elias stood still, shoulders squared, the rifle heavy but steady in his grip. Clara's breath hitched behind him. "She's not yours," Elias said quietly. Hawk chuckled, a low sound that made the sheriff glance at the ground. "Everything a man leaves his mark on is his. And I left mine on her, deeper than you'll ever see." Clara's knees buckled. She pressed harder against the cloth. Elias's jaw clenched. "Lawman," Hawk said, turning to Sheriff Halley. "You know what's right. She's mine." The sheriff shifted uneasily. "If he can prove it." "Proof?" Hawk sneered. His gaze cut to Clara. "Show him. Pull that rag away and let him see what ties you." Clara shook her head violently, tears streaking down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Please, Elias. Don't." Elias felt the weight of the moment pressing down like the sun in midsummer. The cloth trembled under her hand, her whole body trembling with it. To pull it meant pain, blood, perhaps death. To leave it meant Hawk's lies might triumph. His heart thundered. His palms went cold. "Please don't pull it." But Elias McGraw had lived too long in silence, too long letting the whispers of others carve his choices. He looked at Clara, not at her wound but at her eyes fierce through the fear. He realized then that truth, no matter how cruel, was the only mercy left. He stepped closer. "Clara," he whispered, voice breaking. "I'll carry it with you." Her lips parted, breath caught, but she did not stop him this time. With steady hands, Elias pulled the cloth away. Blood welled instantly, crimson staining the quilt of her dress. But beneath the torn flesh, half hidden by the broken arrowhead, lay Hawk Redford's brand, burned cruelly into her skin, a scar shaped like a serpent coiled in flame. Elias's blood ran cold. His grip faltered, his breath stopped. For a heartbeat. He saw not just her wound but every cruelty this land had carved into women like her. The sheriff froze, face blanching. The truth was too stark to deny. Hawk's grin faded, a thin mask slipping. "She's marked," Elias said, voice low, trembling with rage. "But not owned." Clara collapsed into the chair, gasping, blood staining her dress, but her eyes blazed. "You branded me," she hissed at Hawk. "Not to keep me, but to break me." The sheriff straightened, hand finally reaching for his badge. "That ain't a man's claim, Redford. That's a crime." Hawk's smile snapped into a snarl. He went for his pistol, but Elias was quicker. The rifle cracked like thunder. Hawk staggered, the shot grazing his arm, forcing him backward. The sheriff seized the chance, gun drawn now, badge gleaming in the harsh sun. "Hawk Redford, you'll hang for this." The drifter spat in the dust, hatred boiling in his eyes, but he knew when he was beaten. The lawman bound his hands, his voice shaking with both shame and resolve. Elias lowered the rifle, chest heaving, heart heavy. His eyes returned to Clara, her bloodied hand limp on her lap, her breath shallow but steady. Days turned to weeks. Clara healed slowly, the scar a raw reminder, but she no longer covered it. She walked the cabin with quiet dignity, helping where she could, never again speaking of leaving. Neighbors still whispered, "May Callahan among them," but the whispers lost power when the sheriff himself stood in the saloon and declared Hawk Redford a criminal, not Clara Boone a shame. On the ranch, Elias and Clara found a rhythm. She tended the hearth, humming her hymn when storms rolled in. He worked the cattle with steadier hands than before. Sometimes at dusk they sat side by side on the porch, not touching, not declaring, but sharing silence as if it were the rarest gift in the West. Elias no longer felt the land so empty. One evening, as the prairie turned gold, Clara stood with him at the fence line. She touched the scar faintly, her voice low. "You pulled it," she said. "I had to," Elias answered. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she let a faint smile break across her lips. "Then maybe I can breathe again." Elias didn't reply. He only looked at her, and for once, silence carried no burden. Final reflection, narrator's voice to the reader. "I tell you this, stranger, because the West was never just bullets and gold. It was scars, some burned into flesh, some hidden deep in the heart. A man could ride 1,000 miles and never see a battle, but still lose his soul to silence and judgment. Yet sometimes mercy has to be braver than fear. Sometimes a scar has to be seen for healing to begin. And if you remember anything from the tale of Elias McGraw and Clara Boone, remember this. Truth may run a man's blood cold, but it is the only fire that can warm a life back to living.